I'm Stephen Castles from the University of Sydney. I have a research chair in sociology, and with doctoral students we're doing research on how social transformation leads to or transforms human mobility in Korea, South Korea, Turkey, Mexico and Australia. Well, I'm involved in the first chapter, which is called New Social Geographies. And we've been trying to work out what should go into that chapter, because being the first chapter, it's together with chapter 2, the introduction to the whole project. So we need to touch on all the main issues, but without exploring them in great detail.
Definitely.
Migration is seen as a very political issue in most countries. At the moment we have the European refugee crisis, as it's often called, where hundreds of thousands of people are seeking asylum from the wars in the Middle East and the wars in Africa. And it's become a real challenge, not only to political leaders, but also to civic society, how these people can be supported in a situation where, of course, the economies of European countries are not all that strong themselves. So, that is quite a big political issue at the moment. We've been exploring more long-term issues in our research. We're looking, for instance, let me give you an example, maybe it's more interesting. South Korea is a country which has a long-standing image of ethnic homogeneity and having a unitary culture. And now, because industrialization over the last 20 years has led to a very rapid decline in fertility, there is a shortage of people willing to do lower skilled jobs. So there's a labor migration program, but it's mainly for male workers. And at the same time, there's a marriage migration program, which addresses particularly the rural areas, particularly farmers, because women often don't want to stay in the country. They go and take jobs in the city, and it becomes quite difficult for farmers to get wives. So the government actually subsidizes, they give a subsidy to farmers who are seeking a bride, and the farmers pass this subsidy on often to brokers, to agencies, which set up a trip to Vietnam or Cambodia or Kazakhstan, and young women who want to migrate to a more developed country in the hope of a better future for themselves and their families, express their willingness to marry a Korean. So it's a very economic transaction. It's got very little to do with love. So usually the marriage takes place within a week or two of the man going over to these countries. So we see that as a very interesting phenomenon, very exploitative of women in many cases, but also affects Korean culture, because if a large proportion, up to 15% of mothers are not native Koreans, don't necessarily speak Korean very well, and don't know Korean culture, how can they transmit that culture to their children? So it's an interesting aspect of globalization, that culture is changed through this form of migration. Well, I've, for most of my career, worked mainly on international migration. I have done some work on education, but migration is one of the great challenges of our age, and of course it's a product of globalization. As flows of commodities and capital are liberalized, it's very hard to control flows of people. Now there is a competition really at the global level to attract highly skilled people who can bring in IT skills or engineering or management. And at the same time, there is a real need for lower skilled workers who can do the jobs that native populations in industrial countries tend to reject. So we have, for instance, a transnationalization of care work. Many women migrate to look after other women's children. So that woman, for instance, in Singapore, can join the labor market with the skills she's gained through a good education. And then there is the question, what happens to the children of the women who migrate as care workers? Often they, in turn, hire maids to look after the children back home, but it has very serious effects in many cases on the family, on the dynamics of the relationship, and on the upbringing of the children. So there is a lot of research being done by Filipino colleagues on this aspect. So there are many challenges associated with migration, and I think what we are going to see as global flows of capital and commodities grow, flows of people will also grow, which is in fact already happening. I think, I don't want to pretend that migration is the most important topic. I think it's just a part of the very large-scale transformations we're experiencing in world economy and world societies at the moment, so that we have to understand migration really as part of the process of social transformation rather than as something in itself. And I think that's what I would like to bring into the International Panel on Social Progress.